The melody of a lute drifts through the crowded marketplace, weaving between the shouts of merchants and the clatter of wooden carts. It's a sound that would have been as familiar as the tolling of church bells in medieval Europe, a signal that a traveling minstrel had arrived, carrying more than just songs. These wandering artists were the eyes and ears of their time, moving effortlessly between the grandeur of royal courts and the humble hearths of village taverns. They didn't just entertain, they witnessed history unfolding, transforming the struggles and joys of everyday life into stories that would echo across generations. Today, we're stepping into their world, uncovering the untold truths hidden in their ballads and tales, truths that reveal a side of the Middle Ages you won't find in dusty history books. Picture this, a lone figure trudging along a muddy road, their cloak damp from the rain, a well-worn instrument slung across their back. To the nobles, they were a welcome distraction. To the peasants, a rare glimpse of magic in a hardscrabble world. But minstrels were far more than mere performers. They were the newsbringers, the rumor spreaders, the keepers of secrets whispered in castle corridors and rebellions simmering in the fields. Their songs could praise a king one day and mock his taxes the next, all while slipping past the notice of those who might silence them. Through their eyes, we see the medieval world not as a static tapestry of knights and castles, but as a living, breathing place, full of laughter, treachery, and the raw edges of human experience. What makes these wandering storytellers so fascinating isn't just the stories they told, but the ones they lived. Imagine the minstrel who sang at a feast the night before a battle, sensing the tension in the air, or the one who performed for a grieving queen, turning her sorrow into verse. Their lives were a tightrope walk between privilege and peril, dependent on the whims of the powerful yet free in ways few others were. As we follow their journeys, we'll uncover how their music and tales shaped the very fabric of medieval society, how a simple song could unite a village, embarrass a lord, or even change the course of a conflict. This is history not from above, but from the ground, where the mud stuck to your boots and the truth was often sung, not written. So let's begin where they did, on the open road, with the next town just over the horizon and a story waiting to be told. To understand the life of a traveling minstrel, you have to step into their worn-out shoes quite literally. Many began their journeys with little more than the clothes on their backs and an instrument they'd mastered through years of practice. Unlike the bards who enjoyed the steady patronage of noble families, minstrels lived hand to mouth, trading songs for supper and stories for a place to sleep. Their survival depended on an uncanny ability to read a room, whether it was a rowdy tavern full of farmers or a high-born lord's banquet hall. One wrong tune could mean a night in the stocks, but the right one might earn them a silver coin or even a rare invitation to linger longer in comfort. Their days were a mix of grueling travel and spontaneous performance. Rain or shine, they trudged along rutted roads, dodging bandits and wolves, always alert for the next village or castle where they might ply their trade. A typical stop began at the market square, where a lively tune would draw a crowd, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, merchants pausing mid-haggle, even the local priest peering from the church steps. The minstrel's repertoire had to be as varied as their audience, a bawdy joke for the miller, a mournful ballad for the widow, a flattering ode for the visiting knight. And woe betide the performer who forgot a local scandal singing the wrong lord's praises, could turn a warm welcome into a swift ejection. Yet their power lay in this very precariousness. Because they belonged nowhere, they could go anywhere, slipping through social barriers like shadows. a minstrel might share a jest with a charcoal burner at dawn and dine with a baron by dusk, gathering whispers from both. Their songs carried tidings of distant wars, royal marriages, or harvest failures, news that could shape a village's fate. Sometimes they even became pawns in greater games. A clever lord might employ a minstrel to spread propaganda, while rebels used their ballads to rally dissent under the guise of harmless entertainment. No wonder authorities viewed them with suspicion. A well-placed lyric could spark a riot as easily as a sermon, but behind the laughter and music lay a life of profound loneliness. Most minstrels never owned land, married, or put down roots. Their homes were ale-stained benches and haylofts, their families the fleeting camaraderie of other wanderers. In an age when your place in society was fixed at birth, they were rare exceptions, neither peasant nor noble, but something in between, and that's what makes their legacy so extraordinary. Through their eyes, we see medieval Europe not as a hierarchy frozen in stained glass, but as a world alive with movement, change, and the irrepressible human need to tell stories no matter the cost. The roads of medieval Europe were not just dirt and stone, they were threads stitching together a fractured world, and minstrels knew every twist and turn by heart. Imagine setting out at dawn, the chill of dew still clinging to your boots, with nothing but a satchel of bread and a lute strapped to your back, your map. The stories passed down from other wanderers where the innkeepers were generous, which bridges had crumbled, which forests hid thieves in their shadows. Every mile was a gamble. A sunny stretch through open farmland might lull you into comfort, only for the next valley to swallow you in fog so thick you'd hear the howl of wolves before seeing them. Some paths were alive with chatter and cartwheels, like the great pilgrimage routes where minstrels could blend into streams of travelers. The road to Santiago de Compostela, for instance, was a river of humanity, monks chanting psalms, merchants haggling over relics, and nobles on horseback with purses heavy enough to tempt cutpurses. Here, a minstrel could trade a song for a seat on a hay wagon or news of the next town's feast day. But other routes were desolate, where the only company was the caw of crows and the creak of your own footsteps. These were the roads where danger felt heaviest, where a snapped lute string or a twisted ankle could leave you stranded with night falling fast. Bandits were a constant dread, but so were the lawmen who might mistake you for one. A minstrel's cloak, often patched and travel-stained, drew suspicion as easily as admiration. Crossing borders meant navigating a patchwork of local rulers, each with their own petty tolls and rules. Forget to bow to the wrong sheriff's badge, and you might find yourself singing for your supper, literally from behind iron bars. Yet it was this very uncertainty that sharpened their wits. A clever minstrel learned to read a town's mood before playing a single note, spot a gibbet with fresh bones, stick to hymns, see farmers muttering over ale. A satirical ditty about greedy landlords might earn you a bed in their barn. And then there were the unexpected allies, the charcoal burners who'd share their fire if you brought news from the outside world, the nuns who'd trade a psalm for a whispered rumor, the mercenaries who'd let you trail their caravan for protection. Every encounter left its mark, not just in coins or crumbs, but in stories. A chance meeting with a wool trader might inspire a ballad about far-off markets. A night in a monastery scriptorium could add a saint's legend to your repertoire. By the time a minstrel reached the next town, they carried more than songs, they carried pieces of places and people, stitched together into something new. That's the true magic of their journeys. The roads they walked weren't just lines on the ground. They were living things pulsing with gossip, danger, and fleeting kindnesses. To travel them was to weave yourself into the fabric of medieval life, threadbare in places, golden in others, but always unmistakably alive. The heavy oak doors of the castle groan open, and suddenly the minstrel stands in a world of flickering torchlight and whispered intrigues. This is where the stakes were highest, where a single song could earn a purse of gold or a night in the dungeon. Noble audiences were the most demanding, their tastes as varied as their temperaments. A duke might crave heroic tales of his ancestors, while his bored courtiers snickered at sly verses poking fun at the neighboring lord. The cleverest minstrels mastered the art of double meanings, wrapping criticism in compliments so deftly that the target might applaud before realizing they'd been mocked. Take the legendary Pierre de Provence, who once sang of a lion-hearted king to flatter Richard the Lionheart's vanity, while the French court heard it as a jab at his recklessness. Or the unnamed minstrel in Burgundy who performed a ballad about a wise stag who outran foolish hunters, leaving the duke grinning while his rivals seethed. These performers walked a razor's edge. One surviving contract from the 1400s even spells it out. A minstrel was paid extra to omit all verses touching upon the Lady of Flanders, after a previous singer had drunkenly alluded to her rumored affairs. But castles weren't just stages, they were treasure troves of secrets. Minstrels lingered in shadows, catching fragments of conversations between courses. A lord's boast about troop movements might become a coded warning in next week's tavern song. A lady's whispered grief over a lost child could turn into a lament that moved audiences to tears. Their unique position, important enough to perform at high tables but disposable enough to be ignored, made them perfect spies. Some were even employed as messengers, carrying sensitive information disguised as lyrics. A manuscript from Milan describes how a minstrel's love song contained hidden directions for a rebel attack, with each flower in the verse marking a different gate in the city walls. Yet the greatest risk wasn't carrying secrets, it was becoming one. Many a minstrel vanished after learning too much, their fate as uncertain as the last note of an unfinished tune. Those who thrived understood the unspoken rules, laugh louder at the lord's jokes than anyone else, never outshine the court bard, and always have a fast horse waiting. Because in the end, the castle was just another stop on the road, one where the applause could turn to arrows if you overstayed your welcome. And so they moved on, carrying fragments of courtly splendor to smoky taverns where farmers would gasp at tales of silk-clad nobles and jeweled goblets. The minstrel's gift wasn't just entertainment, it was making the distant world of power feel close enough to touch, yet strange enough to marvel at. Whether singing for a king or a ploughman, they reminded everyone that behind every castle wall beat the same human heart, proud, fragile, and hungry for stories. The village square erupts in laughter as the minstrel strums a bawdy tune about a miller's misadventures, his voice rising above the clatter of wooden tankards and the snort of tethered goats. This is where the music truly came alive, not in the hushed halls of castles, but in the dust and din of places where people worked, loved, and grumbled under the weight of feudal life. Here, a minstrel's success wasn't measured in silver coins, but in stomping feet and raucous sing-alongs. The songs that stuck weren't about distant heroes or polished courtly love, but about the harvest that failed, the sweetheart who got away, or the lord who taxed the last loaf of bread. These were stories spun from the same threadbare cloth as their audiences' lives. Taverns offered a different kind of stage, low ceilings thick with smoke, benches packed with weary laborers, and an unspoken rule that no performance should outlast the ale. A minstrel might start with a rousing ballad about Robin Hood, tweaking the details to match whatever local official was least popular that week. The crowd would roar approval, banging cups on tables, while the bailiff in the corner scowled into his drink. Unlike the polished recitals of courts, these shows were messy, democratic affairs. A farmer might shout a crude verse to add to the song, a butcher's wife demand a favorite lament, or a group of rowdy apprentices start their own competing chorus. The best minstrels rode the chaos like sailors in a storm, turning hecklers into co-conspirators with a wink and a well-timed joke, but beneath the merriment lay something sharper. When a minstrel sang of a fox outwitting a huntmaster, everyone heard the parable of peasants outsmarting tax collectors. A mournful tune about a village drowned by floods might carry whispers of a real disaster 3 valleys over, news travelers hadn't yet brought. In an age when few could read and fewer still traveled beyond their fields, minstrels were the living newspapers, their songs stitching together scattered communities. A rebellion brewing in Flanders could inspire a coded work song in a French vineyard by the next full moon. The most enduring tales weren't just entertainment, they were survival. Take the ballad of the Wife of Usher's Well, where a mother's grief summons her dead sons back for one night, a stark reminder of how often plague and war emptied cradles. Or the drinking songs that mocked the clergy's hypocrisy, letting villagers vent frustrations too dangerous to voice plainly. Every joke about a greedy bishop, every lament for a child lost to fever, every rousing chorus about outlaws in the greenwood, these weren't just stories. They were the collective heartbeat of a people who had few other ways to speak their truths, and that's why minstrels mattered far beyond their music. In a world where the powerful wrote the histories, these wanderers carried the voices of those who left no parchment behind. When they packed up their loots and moved on, they didn't just take coins and applause, they carried the hopes, grudges, and secret resilience of every village they'd ever made laugh or weep under the open sky. The strings of a minstrel's lute didn't just play notes, they plucked the very heartstrings of medieval society. Every melody carried layers of meaning, from the grandest heroic epic to the raunchiest tavern ditty. Take the Song of Roland, a sweeping tale of knights and sacrifice that noble audiences demanded at feasts. On the surface, it celebrated Charlemagne's glory, but villagers heard something different, a coded warning about the cost of blind loyalty to distant rulers. That was the minstrel's genius, wrapping uncomfortable truths in glittering verse so sweet, even kings swallowed them whole. Romantic ballads, too, were never just about love. When a minstrel sang of a lady pining for her knight, it mirrored the arranged marriages binding noble families, yet the best songs always let the lady outsmart her guards or the knight choose love over war. Peasants adored these tales, seeing their own dreams of agency in the adventures of fictional nobles. Meanwhile, the drinking songs roaring through alehouses turned society upside down. In The Miller and the Priest, a lowly grain grinder outwits a corrupt clergyman, giving voice to every farmer who ever seethed at tithes. These weren't mere jokes, they were pressure valves for a world with few ways to protest. The most powerful songs blurred the line between news and art. After the Black Death, a haunting refrain spread across Europe, "Where have all the flowers gone?" Its simple melody carrying the grief of emptied villages. Minstrels adapted it endlessly. In France, it became a lament for lost children. In Germany, a protest against landlords demanding rent from graves. Even joyful tunes hid barbs. Summer is Ikumen in. That bright celebration of spring took on new meaning when sung by starving peasants during famine years, the cheerful lyrics a stark contrast to hollow cheeks. What made this musical code so effective was its deniability. A lord might chuckle at a song mocking his rival, only to realize too late his own faults were the next verse's target. Authorities tried banning certain ballads, but how do you outlaw a melody that changes with every singer? The very flexibility that kept minstrels poor, always crafting new verses for each audience, made their art impossible to silence. When parchment crumbled and castles fell, these songs endured, passed mouth to mouth like a whispered rebellion against forgetting. And so the minstrel's true legacy wasn't just in the stories they told, but in the spaces they carved between the lines. In a world where speaking truth could mean a noose, music became the perfect disguise. Serious ideas dressed in laughter, protests wrapped in love songs, history written not in ink but in the collective memory of 1,000 voices singing the same tune with secretly different words. A minstrel's instrument was more than wood and string. It was a passport to survival, a tool as vital as the road beneath their feet. Picture the lute, its pear-shaped body cradled against a traveler's chest, strings humming with stories from a dozen kingdoms. Its delicate tones could flatter a countess or mimic the whisper of lovers in a ballad, but it demanded skill. A poorly tuned lute in a noble hall might earn a minstrel a night in the stables instead of a bed. Yet for all its elegance, the lute had a rebellious cousin, the gittern, smaller and sturdier, with a bright, cheeky sound perfect for taverns where ale sloshed and tempers flared. Then there were the harps, glittering like jewels in candlelit chambers. Their cascading notes painted scenes of Arthurian legends or Celtic heroes, but their fragility made them rare on the open road. Only the luckiest minstrels, those with steady patrons, could afford such treasures. More common was the fiddle, its bow dancing across strings to mimic laughter, tears, or the clash of swords. Unlike the refined violins of later centuries, medieval fiddles were rough-hewn and loud, capable of cutting through the din of a market square or the roar of a feast. But rhythm was the heartbeat of performance, and that's where drums and tambourines seized the stage. A tabor slung over the shoulder let a minstrel play pipe and drums simultaneously, one hand trilling a melody while the other pounded out a march. In villages, these driving beats turned listeners into participants, feet stomping, hands clapping, voices rising in unison. A skilled percussionist could whip a crowd into frenzy or hush them with a single, suspenseful roll. Portability dictated as much as artistry. The hurdy-gurdy, with its crank-turned wheel and drone strings, was a one-man band strapped to the hip. Rain or frost couldn't warp its sound, making it a favorite for winter travels. Recorders, carved from bone or simple wood, slipped into pockets and could mimic birdsong for children or herald a king's entrance with equal ease. Even humble objects became instruments. A comb wrapped in parchment buzzed like a bee. A washboard scraped with thimbles became a feast day rhythm section. The choice of instrument was a silent language. A lute at a crossroads might signal a minstrel seeking noble employment, while a raucous pipe and drum announced a performer ready to rouse a thirsty crowd. Together, these tools didn't just make music, they wove an audible map of medieval life, from the reverent hush of a cathedral courtyard to the raucous joy of a harvest dance. To hear them now is to eavesdrop on a world where every note carried meaning, and a well-played tune could mean the difference between a full belly and an empty one. Festivals and fairs pulsed with a kind of magic that even castles couldn't match, a swirling chaos of colors, smells, and sounds where a minstrel's fortunes could change in an afternoon. Take the great champagne fairs where the air buzzed with a dozen languages, and the dust kicked up by merchants' carts mingled with the scent of roasting chestnuts and spiced wine. Here, a performer didn't just sing for supper, they battled for survival in a whirlwind of competition. Acrobats tumbled past fire eaters, puppet shows drew squealing children, and amid it all, minstrels had to project their voices over the din of haggling and livestock. This was the medieval equivalent of a talent show, one where the prize was a handful of coins, a free meal, or, if you were truly exceptional, an invitation to travel with a noble's retinue. The smartest minstrels treated these events like a theater of the absurd, tailoring their acts to the crowd's shifting moods. early in the day when farmers arrived with fresh produce, a ballad about a bountiful harvest might earn a wedge of cheese or a sack of apples. By noon, as merchants grew flush from sales, a flattering tune comparing them to King Solomon could loosen purse strings. And as evening fell and ale flowed freely, that's when the risky material came out: bawdy jokes about unfaithful spouses, satirical jabs at tax collectors, or the ever-popular The Miller and the Devil, where a clever peasant outsmarts the underworld itself. Timing was everything. One surviving account from 14th century Bruges describes a minstrel who interrupted a sermon with a raucous drinking song, only to flee when the priest rallied an angry mob. But festivals weren't just about survival, they were laboratories for innovation. A minstrel might hear a Moorish trader's drum rhythm in the morning and weave it into a ballad by dusk, or borrow a troupe of dancers to turn a solo act into a spectacle. The fairs of Frankfurt even had a tradition called the song duel, where two performers improvised verses until one ran out of rhymes, a crowd pleaser that could turn rivals into collaborators by nightfall. And because these gatherings drew people from distant regions, a hit song in Provence might spread to Germany by the next season, mutating with each retelling like a game of medieval telephone. Behind the revelry lay a delicate social dance. Minstrels knew which guilds paid best weavers and goldsmiths were notoriously generous, which towns had strict noise ordinances, Augsburg fined singers who performed past curfew, and how to avoid the pickpockets who lurked near every captivated audience. They also mastered the art of exit strategies. A song mocking the local bishop might bring roaring applause until his steward appeared in the crowd. The wisest performers kept one eye on the audience and the other on the nearest alley, ready to vanish mid-chorus if needed. What made these gatherings so vital was their sheer democracy. In a world rigidly divided by class, festivals were rare spaces where a countess might toss a coin to the same minstrel a beggar cheered. The music that thrived here wasn't the refined artifice of courts, but something raw, immediate, and alive, a reflection of the joy, grit, and rebellious spirit of ordinary people. When the tents packed up and the crowds dispersed, the minstrels carried fragments of that energy with them, stitching together a patchwork of stories, tunes, and inside jokes that would echo across kingdoms. No two fairs were ever alike, but each one left its mark on the performer's repertoire and on the hungry hearts of those who'd laughed and sung along under the open sky. The drumbeat of marching feet, the clang of swords being sharpened, this was the soundtrack minstrels followed straight into the heart of war. While monks recorded battles in tidy Latin script, these wandering storytellers stood in the mud and chaos, turning raw terror into something people could sing about. Take the famous siege of Orleans during the 100 Years' War, where minstrels circulated among Joan of Arc's troops, spinning her visions into rousing anthems that made farm boys feel like archangels. Their verses didn't just describe the fight, they became weapons as tangible as arrows. A well-timed ballad about past victories could stiffen the spines of trembling recruits at dawn, while a mournful tune after nightfall let soldiers grieve without shedding tears. But their role went beyond motivation. Minstrels were medieval embedded journalists, their songs the only news dispatches most civilians would ever hear. After the Battle of Agincourt, it wasn't official proclamations that spread first. It was the minstrels who slipped through enemy lines, carrying tunes about English longbowmen and French knights drowning in mud. These weren't neutral reports. A minstrel in English pay might sing of Henry V's divine favor, while one hired by Burgundians emphasized the slaughter of noble prisoners. The same battle could become 10 different stories by month's end, each tailored to the political needs of whoever fed the singer last. The risks were staggering. At the 1385 Battle of El Jubarota, a Portuguese minstrel named Martim was said to have stood on a hilltop, drumming a signal rhythm that guided his king's troops until an arrow found his throat. Others fell to disease in camp, were trampled in retreats, or vanished into the maw of ransom markets. Yet the rewards tempted many. A minstrel who pleased a victorious commander might receive land or a permanent court position, exchanging their wandering cloak for velvet robes. The legendary Blondel de Nesle supposedly roamed Europe singing at castle walls until his voice revealed Richard the Lionheart's prison tower, a tale likely embroidered over time, but proof of how minstrels' wartime service blurred into myth. Their most enduring legacy, though, was turning senseless bloodshed into narrative. When a minstrel sang of Crécy or Nicopolis, they didn't dwell on burst bowels or the stench of rotting corpses. They spoke of honor, sacrifice, and the few shimmering moments of courage that make war bearable to remember. In doing so, they gave communities a way to process loss without drowning in it, to transform a field of dead strangers into heroes their grandchildren would weep over. That alchemy, more than any sword stroke, shaped how medieval Europe understood conflict, not as it was, but as it needed to be remembered to keep living. The church bells tolling across medieval Europe didn't just call the faithful to prayer, they set the rhythm for minstrels' lives too. These wandering performers existed in the shadow of the steeple, their songs swinging between devotion and defiance like a pendulum. Picture a dusty road to Santiago de Compostela, where pilgrims limped along with blistered feet, and among them walked minstrels singing hymns to keep spirits high. Their voices rose in harmonies about saintly miracles, turning grueling journeys into moving acts of collective faith. At shrines like Canterbury or Rocamadour, they might perform sacred plays, dramatizing the martyrdom of Thomas Becket or the Virgin Mary's mercy, earning alms from weeping onlookers. For many peasants who'd never heard a Latin Mass, these performances were their Bible, scripture translated into song and gesture. Yet the same minstrel who brought tears to pilgrims' eyes with a ballad of the Virgin's sorrow might slip into a tavern later that night to croon The Abbot and the Shepherdess, a raunchy tale of clerical hypocrisy that had drinkers snorting ale through their noses. This duality wasn't just survival, it reflected the conflicted soul of medieval Christianity itself. The church demanded reverence but bred resentment with its tithes and excesses, and minstrels gave voice to both impulses. A particularly clever performer could even blur the lines, like the German minstrel who set verses from Ecclesiastes to a popular drinking tune, leaving audiences so merry they didn't notice they'd memorized scripture. The risks of satire were real. In 1322, a Parisian minstrel was flogged for singing a song comparing cardinals to crows picking at Europe's bones. But the church also knew the power of music to spread its message. Some monasteries kept minstrels on retainer to turn saints' lives into catchy rhymes, while bishops hired them to perform morality plays where virtue triumphed in iambic pentameter. The most cunning ecclesiastical lords even used minstrels as propaganda tools. After the Albigensian Crusade, troubadours were paid to compose songs painting heretics as devil worshippers, ensuring the official narrative reached illiterate villagers. What's fascinating is how minstrels threaded this needle. They mastered the art of plausible deniability, coating criticism in just enough piety to avoid the stake. A ballad about a certain greedy shepherd could be defended as an allegory about King David's sins if authorities objected. Playful parodies of liturgical chants, like the Drinker's Mass, where wine replaced holy water, walked the line between blasphemy and humor so finely that even priests sometimes joined in the laughter. And when repression grew too fierce, minstrels simply took their act underground. The Carmina Burana manuscript, hidden for centuries in a Bavarian monastery, proves how subversive songs survived. its pages mixed devout hymns with lyrics celebrating gambling, drinking, and lusty monks. This dance between sacred and profane reveals a deeper truth about medieval faith. It wasn't monolithic. The same villagers who crossed themselves at every bell might cheer a song mocking their gluttonous parish priest, seeing no contradiction. Minstrels, ever the mirrors of their audiences, reflected this messy humanity, their lutes equally at home accompanying a hymn to the Virgin or a ditty about a nun's secret lover. In doing so, they reminded everyone that holiness and humor could share the same stage, and that sometimes the most powerful prayers were the ones that made you laugh through your tears. The lute strings trembled with a different kind of magic when minstrels turned to love, a language of sighs, stolen glances, and heartbreak that transcended the rigid walls of medieval society. These weren't just songs, they were rebellion set to melody. Take the tale of Tristan and Isolde, a ballad that spread like wildfire across Europe. On the surface, it was a tragic romance about a knight and his king's bride, but every peasant listening heard the subtext: love doesn't bow to crowns or contracts. Minstrels performed it with a wink in taverns and a shudder in castles, letting each audience project their own longing onto the story. For nobles, it was a cautionary tale. For the common folk, it was proof that even the mighty couldn't cage the heart. Courtly love songs, with their flowery metaphors and endless pining, might sound stiff to modern ears until you realize they were medieval fan fiction. Knights and ladies trapped in arranged marriages lived vicariously through verses about chaste adoration and heroic devotion. A minstrel singing "Canve la loz at a mover, when I see the lark beating its wings," wasn't just praising a lady's beauty, he was offering a script for how to yearn without breaking social rules. The genius lay in the loopholes. These songs glorified desire while insisting it remain unconsummated, letting aristocrats flirt with passion without threatening their power structures. But for every polished ode, there were a dozen raunchy counterpoints. In the alley behind the tavern, the same minstrel might croon "The Miller's Daughter," where a quick-witted peasant girl outsmarts a lecherous lord by leaving him stranded in his underwear. These weren't just jokes, they were fantasies of inversion, where the lowborn triumphed and the powerful were fools. Women especially clung to these stories. A laundress humming "The Knight and the Shepherd's Wife" could imagine a world where her "no" meant something, even if reality offered little protection. The most dangerous love songs, though, were the ones rooted in truth. When Elena of Aquitaine's court minstrels sang of her grandfather's scandalous divorce, everyone knew it was a barely veiled commentary on her own fractured marriage to Louis Roman VII. Likewise, the ballad "Fair Rosamond," about Henry Roman II's mistress allegedly poisoned by his queen, circulated for centuries because it tapped into real fears. That love could be deadly, and that even royalty bled when hearts broke. What makes these ballads so enduring is their honesty. They admit what parish priests and lawbooks tried to deny: that desire is messy, reckless, and utterly human. Whether performed in a drafty hall or a sunlit field, they gave voice to the whispers behind closed shutters. The wife sighing over a childhood sweetheart, the squire coveting his lord's daughter, the widow remembering warmth long gone. In a world where marriages were treaties and affection was currency, minstrels kept alive the radical idea that love might belong to the lovers themselves. The life of a minstrel wasn't all applause and ale sometimes. The wrong song could land you in the stocks or worse. Imagine standing in a crowded square, not to perform but to endure the sting of the lash or the jeers of a mob, all because your lyrics brushed too close to the truth. Authorities knew the power of these wandering storytellers, and when a minstrel's words threatened the social order, punishment came swiftly and publicly. A ballad mocking a noble's greed might earn you a day clamped in iron restraints. Your hands, those skilled hands that plucked lute strings, now helpless as rotten fruit splattered against your face. For repeat offenders, branding was common. A hot iron searing the mark of an outlaw into flesh, ensuring no town would welcome you again. But some minstrels wore their outlaw status like a badge of honor. Take Alan A. Dale, the merry musician of Robin Hood's legend, who supposedly used his songs to distract the sheriff's men while outlaws robbed tax collectors. Whether real or embellished, his story reveals a tantalizing truth. Minstrels could be as dangerous with a melody as a bandit with a blade. Their weapons were wit and rhythm, turning public executions into opportunities for subversion. There's a record from 14th century York of a minstrel singing a comic dirge as a condemned thief mounted the gallows. The crowd's laughter so unnerved the bailiffs that they cut the man down and exiled him instead. The church wielded its own forms of punishment. A minstrel caught parodying holy hymns might be forced to kneel barefoot on the cathedral steps, chanting psalms until their voice gave out. Others faced excommunication, their very souls cast adrift in the eyes of the community. Yet even this couldn't always silence them. In the shadow of Notre Dame, a band performer named Jacot the Tongue reportedly taught his songs to street children, who spread them like dandelion seeds, untraceable and unstoppable. For those who escaped punishment, survival meant mastering the art of disguise. A minstrel on the run might trade their lute for a pilgrim's staff, their colorful cloak for a monk's drab robes. Some joined traveling troupes of actors, hiding seditious verses inside morality plays. Others became green men, living wild in forests where their songs mingled with the rustle of leaves, waiting for the day they could return to the market square. The irony was delicious. The very thing that made minstrels vulnerable, their visibility, also protected them. A lord might hang a common thief in secret, but silencing a popular singer risked turning them into a martyr. When the minstrel Pierre de Crayon was imprisoned for lampooning the Duke of Anjou, crowds gathered outside the castle gates singing his band songs back to the walls. The Duke, fearing unrest, released him within a week. This was the minstrel's ultimate revenge, to be remembered. Long after the whips and brands faded, their songs endured, carried on the lips of people who understood that every joke at a lord's expense was a tiny crack in the foundation of power. The air hung thick with the scent of burning herbs and decay as the minstrel picked his way through the silent streets. Where once his music had competed with the clamor of markets, now only the occasional wail of grief or the rasp of a death cart's wheels broke the stillness. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it devoured the very sound of life. Yet in this suffocating quiet, minstrels became something new, not just entertainers, but the keepers of collective memory in a world unraveling. Those who dared to perform during the plague years faced impossible choices: stay in the city and risk infection, or flee to the countryside where starving survivors might rob you blind. Some minstrels turned to pest songs, morbid yet strangely comforting ballads that named the unnameable. A Danse Macabre was the most famous, a grinning allegory where skeletons led kings and peasants alike in a final, equalizing revel. Its gallows humor gave terrified audiences permission to laugh at death, even as they clutched their rosaries. Other performers adapted medical advice into rhyming couplets, turning physicians' dubious remedies into catchy ditties. Garlic, gold, and vinegar bright slash keep the fiendish pest at bay tonight. But the most haunting ballads were those born from raw witness. A minstrel in Florence sang of lovers separated by quarantine walls, their voices carrying across barred windows. Another in Avignon composed a lullaby for orphaned children, its melody so piercing that even hardened monks were said to weep. These weren't just songs, they were lifelines thrown into the void, proof that beauty could still exist amid ruin. And when words failed, music spoke the drone of a hurdy-gurdy, mimicking the wheeze of labored breathing, a fiddle's shriek echoing the sudden agony of buboes bursting. The plague also exposed minstrels' precarious place in society. Wealthy patrons who once showered them with coin now barred their gates, fearing contagion from wandering strangers. Some minstrels survived by attaching themselves to funeral processions, their dirges blending with the clang of church bells. Others became accidental chroniclers, their verses preserving details official records ignored. The way a mass grave smelled after rain, or the eerie joy of survivors sharing a stolen cask of wine in a deserted tavern. What's remarkable is how their music evolved. Pre-plague songs had been full of courtly love and heroic exploits, but now a raw urgency hummed beneath every note. The Straw Death Ballad, popular in Germany, told of farmers dying so fast they were buried in the fields where they fell, their graves marked only by trampled wheat. It was art stripped bare, with no room for pretense, much like the people who listened, their faces gaunt but their eyes alight with the fragile hope that someone, at least, was still singing. By the time the worst passed, minstrels found themselves changed. The survivors carried scars unseen, a tendency to flinch at coughing in the crowd, a habit of counting audience members 24 today, half last week, none by month's end. Yet they also bore a terrible gift, the ability to transform grief into something shared, to weave loss into melody so it might hurt a little less. When they sang of the plague years afterward, it wasn't with the detachment of historians, but the intimate tremor of those who'd stood at the edge of the abyss and played their lutes into the dark. A minstrel tuning his lute by a Genos merchant stall wasn't just preparing for a performance, he was plugging into the nervous system of medieval commerce. While monks recorded transactions in ledgers and nobles taxed them, these wandering musicians became the living spreadsheets of their age, their songs humming with data about wool prices in Flanders or the going rate for Venetian glass. Take the bustling Champagne fairs, where traders from a dozen lands shouted in as many languages. Here, a minstrel's ballad about the merchant's misfortune wasn't just entertainment, it was a cautionary tale woven with real details, which bridges had collapsed under overloaded carts, which toll collectors demanded bribes, even which inns watered down their wine. Merchants leaned closer during these verses, memorizing the warnings disguised as rhymes. The smartest minstrels cultivated relationships with guilds and caravan masters. A performer who regularly traveled the route between Bruges and Florence could deliver more than songs. He might carry a sealed letter for a wool merchant or whisper news of a shipwreck that would spike silk prices. Some even developed coded melodies. In the archives of the Hanseatic League, there's mention of a minstrel paid to embed grain prices into a love song's refrain, the numbers hidden in the count of stanzas. This wasn't espionage, it was early market intelligence delivered in a form no highwayman would think to steal, but their true economic power lay in shaping reputations. A well-placed ballad could make or break a merchant standing like the tune that swept through 13th century Paris, accusing a spice trader of selling peppercorns stuffed with lead. Within weeks, the man's stall stood empty, proving that in an era before credit scores, a minstrel's tongue was the original Yelp review. Conversely, the Ballad of Honest Heinrich, praising a linen seller's fair measures, became so popular the man commissioned copies to distribute at fairs, turning art into advertising. The rise of banking only deepened their role. When letters of credit needed verification, some Italian money changers kept minstrels on staff to vouch for travelers' identities, their memories honed by years of remembering faces and stories. A performer might not know a florin from a ducat, but he could spot a liar by how they flinched at certain lyrics. This informal trust network became so vital that some trading hubs like Lübeck had designated market minstrels, whose primary job was mediating disputes with a well-timed joke or distracting tense negotiations with a neutral song. What's fascinating is how minstrels navigated this dual identity. By day, they might perform a solemn ode to a banker's piety for his chapel dedication. By night, they'd sing the raucous counting house blues to clerks blowing off steam. Their art thrived in the gap between official records and human truth where a ledger showed numbers. Their songs revealed the sweaty palms, broken promises, and wild gambles behind those numbers. When they strummed tales of bankrupt lords or cunning apprentices outsmarting greedy masters, they weren't just entertaining. They were documenting the seismic shifts as Europe lurched from feudalism toward capitalism, one verse at a time. And so the minstrel's final irony: the very people who lived outside the economic system became its most vibrant chroniclers. Their ballads preserved the scent of Baltic timber in Dutch harbors, the clink of silver crossing Italian counting tables, the groans of farmers buckling under debt, not as dry facts, but as stories that made listeners feel the terrifying thrill of a world where money, for the first time, could change your fate as swiftly as a well-sung note. A minstrel's true instrument wasn't just their lute. It was their tongue, bending and twisting to mimic the rhythms of a dozen dialects. Picture a performer in the bustling port of Marseille, switching effortlessly from the nasal twang of Provençal to the guttural German of Hanseatic merchants, then slipping into the lyrical cadence of an Italian love song. This linguistic agility wasn't just impressive, it was survival. In a world where villages 10 miles apart spoke distinct variants of the same language, minstrels became living Rosetta Stones, stitching together fragments of understanding through melody and rhythm. Their secret lay in what we'd now call code switching, the art of adjusting speech to fit their audience. A ballad about knights might roll with the aristocratic French of courtly romances when sung in a castle, but the same tale would sprout earthy Anglo-Saxon verbs and bawdy puns in a London tavern. Some even crafted hybrid languages, like the macaronic songs that mixed Latin hymns with vernacular slang, letting drunk students and pious monks laugh at the same jokes for different reasons. The Carmina Burana manuscripts reveal this brilliantly, where sacred texts rub shoulders with drinking songs in a linguistic stew that still feels startlingly modern. Melody served as the ultimate universal translator. A minstrel arriving in a Hungarian village might not know a word of Magyar, but if they played the opening notes of Greensleeves, a tune already centuries old by the Middle Ages faces would light with recognition. Instrumental refrains became handshakes, bridging gaps where words failed. Dance tunes were particularly powerful. The same stomping rhythm that set Flemish peasants spinning could get Sicilian nobles tapping their feet, proving music needed no dictionary. Yet their greatest linguistic trick was hiding complexity in simplicity. Take the refrain of Elham Armé, the armed man, a melody so straightforward it spread across Europe with countless lyrical adaptations. In France, it warned of Ottoman threats. In Spain, it became a pilgrimage hymn. In Burgundy, a love allegory. The tune was the scaffold, while local dialects provided the decoration. This flexibility made minstrels indispensable in border regions, where a single song might soothe tensions between rival villages by highlighting shared folklore buried under surface differences. Slang and wordplay were their stealth weapons. A minstrel performing near the Welsh marches might drop a line about the fox in the rye, innocuous to English soldiers, but a coded reference to rebel hideouts for local ears. In cities, they mastered the patois of guilds and thieves, slipping market gossip into ballads or warning of tax collectors through seemingly innocent rhymes. Linguists today mine these songs for treasures, like the sole surviving example of 13th century Venetian street slang preserved in a minstrel's joke about a fisherman's wife. What's extraordinary is how these wandering performers shaped languages even as they borrowed them. The English word ballad comes from the Old French ballade, but it was minstrels who carried it across borders, smoothing its edges until it felt native everywhere. Their songs preserved vanishing dialects like the lilting Occitan of troubadours, which might have disappeared entirely without musical preservation. In an age before dictionaries or grammars, minstrels were the unwritten textbooks of spoken language, proving that while kingdoms might build walls, melodies always found a way through. The lute wasn't the only instrument slung across travelers' backs sometimes. It was a woman's voice cutting through the tavern's din, her cloak damp from the same rains that soaked her male counterparts. Female minstrels walked the same roads but faced a landscape bristling with extra perils. A man might be mocked for a sour note. A woman risked far worse: assault, accusations of witchcraft, or the crushing weight of a reputation shattered by mere suspicion. Yet they persisted, their stories stitched into the margins of history like faint embroidery on a well-worn tunic. Take the troubadours of southern France, noble women who composed and performed courtly songs in Occitan during the 12th and 13th centuries. Unlike common minstrels, these women wrote of love from their own perspective, not as passive objects of desire, but as complex figures wrestling with power and passion. The Comtessa de Dia's haunting, a chanter aimeur de ce que no voleria, I must sing of what I would not wish, burns with raw vulnerability, her voice defiant even as it trembles. I'm left to sleep alone in bitter sorrow. For noble women, music was one of the few acceptable outlets for self-expression, yet even they faced whispers. A troubadour's affair was romantic, a troubadouress could ruin her. Lower-born women minstrels navigated even stormier waters. Some traveled in pairs or small troops for safety, like the German Spielmännin, who performed acrobatics and songs at markets while their husbands juggled or played drums. Others disguised themselves as boys, their voices carefully pitched to avoid suspicion, a dangerous game, as discovery could mean exile or worse. Records from York in the 1300s mention a minstrel maid fined for performing without a male guardian, her crime simply standing alone with a fiddle. What's heartbreaking is how many voices are lost. Most female performers left no written traces. Their ballads survived only if some monk or noble bothered to transcribe them. The rare exceptions shine like gold in river mud. Like the anonymous wife of Bath's sister, a minstrel referenced in Chaucer's tales who could dance and sing as any nightingale, her real name erased but her spirit preserved in fiction. Or Catalina de Eroso, the Basque lieutenant nun, who fled a convent in the 1600s and reportedly earned her keep as a traveling musician before joining the Spanish army, living proof that some women hacked their own paths through the thicket of expectations. Their legacy lingers in the stubborn cracks of history. When a modern scholar pores over church ledgers spotting fines paid by women with lutes, or deciphers a fresco of a female fiddler painted over by later hands, they're piecing together a mosaic of resilience. These performers didn't just sing about knights and fair maidens, they rewrote the script with every note, proving that even in a world built to silence them, some melodies were too powerful to stifle. A minstrel's stomach was as much a barometer of fortune as their purse, one night groaning under the weight of roasted swan at a duke's table, the next clenching around nothing but a crust of stale bread shared with a sympathetic shepherd. These wandering performers lived the extremes of medieval dining, their experiences revealing the stark chasm between noble feasts and peasant survival. Picture the scene, a great hall decked with tapestries, where a minstrel performs between courses of spit roasted boar glazed with honey, while servants circulate with trays of spiced wine and sugared almonds. The songs they sang at such moments, like the famous Capon's Crown, celebrating a mythical chicken so large it fed 100 men, were laced with inside jokes about the absurd excess of the wealthy. Yet the same performer might wake to a breakfast of thin gruel in a monastery guesthouse, or trade a ballad for a wedge of hard cheese at a farmer's doorstep. The contrast wasn't just about quantity but quality. At noble tables, minstrels sampled dishes that would make modern food historians swoon: saffron-infused potages, peacocks redressed in their own iridescent feathers, even elaborate subtleties where castles made of sugar crumbled dramatically when sliced. Their songs preserved recipes now lost, like the 4 and 20 blackbirds pie that actually contained live birds under the crust, released to flap about the hall for entertainment. But these luxuries came with strings. A minstrel who praised a lord's venison pasty too enthusiastically might find themselves pressured to stay indefinitely as a permanent entertainer, trading freedom for full bellies. On the road, survival meant mastering edible geography. They learned which monasteries distributed hearty bean pottage to travelers on saints' days, which inns near pilgrimage routes stretched stew with extra barley, and where to forage for sorrel and wild garlic when coins ran low. Their ballads became accidental cookbooks. The Beggar's Banquet humorously listed roadside finds: snared rabbits, stolen apples, hedgehog roasted in clay, while The Miller's Feast mocked the meager meals of the poor, where a single herring had to feed a family of 5. Hunger was such a constant companion that some minstrels developed tricks to stave it off, like chewing licorice root to suppress appetite, or carrying a hollowed-out loaf stuffed with bacon fat to nibble secretly during performances. The social divides in their diet were stark. A minstrel performing for merchants might receive silver and a taste of exotic imports: dried figs from Constantinople, peppercorns worth their weight in silver. In villages, payment came as whatever was seasonal: a sack of turnips in winter, fresh strawberries in June, or a shared sip of homemade elderflower wine. Some songs even encoded food warnings, like the Breton ballad about a poisoned apple that actually warned against eating the Lord's reserve crop during famines. The cleverest minstrels turned scarcity into art. The Empty Pot Symphony used percussion on cookware to satirize lean harvests, while The Bishop's Fat Cat contrasted clerical gluttony with starving parishioners. What makes these culinary snapshots so poignant is their intimacy. When a minstrel sang of smelling a peasant's onion soup simmering over a fire, the scent mingling with wood smoke and damp wool, they captured a moment no chronicle would record. Their songs preserved not just the taste of medieval life, but its texture: the grit of coarse bread between teeth, the warmth of mulled cider on a frozen night, the collective sigh when a shared wheel of cheese proved moldy. In an age when food was the most visceral marker of status, minstrels experienced every rung of the ladder, their music bridging the distance between the feasting hall and the hungry road. A minstrel stepping into the marketplace didn't just arrive with a song. They arrived in a costume that spoke before they sang a single note. Imagine a cloak stitched from a dozen fabrics, each patch a souvenir from a different town, fluttering like a flag of their wanderings. Their hats, often wide-brimmed and pinned with feathers or bells, weren't just whimsy. They were billboards announcing, "Look here, I'm not like you." In a world where peasants wore drab wool and nobles flaunted silks locked behind sumptuary laws, minstrels dressed in the liminal space between bright enough to catch the eye, but ragged enough to remind everyone they belonged nowhere. This flamboyance was strategic. A performer in a vermilion tunic and emerald hose could command attention in a crowded square, their colors cutting through the dust like a shout through whispers. But those same hues also marked them as outsiders, free from the rules binding others. A farmer might be fined for wearing linen too fine for his station, but a minstrel could strut in mismatched velvets and be forgiven, so long as they entertained. Their garb became a kind of armor, shielding them from the full weight of societal judgment while amplifying their otherness. Yet within this riot of color lay subtle hierarchies. A minstrel wearing silver-threaded embroidery likely boasted a patron, perhaps a duke who'd gifted the outfit after a particularly rousing performance. Their boots would be sturdy, their cloak lined against the cold, their hat adorned with a badge from some noble house. Contrast that with the street singer whose tunic was more patch than original fabric, their shoes bound with twine to keep the soles from flapping. The difference wasn't just wealth, it was access. The finely dressed performer moved in circles where a snapped lute string meant a servant fetched a replacement, while the ragged one sang for coins to buy supper and maybe, if luck held, a new string by winter. But the most fascinating detail, how quickly these costumes could shift. A minstrel might don a sober brown robe to perform a pious ballad at a monastery, then strip it off to reveal a flashy crimson doublet for the tavern crowd after dark. Some even carried disguise kits, a plain hood to blend in at tense border crossings, or a fake pilgrim's badge to secure charity on lean days. Their wardrobe was as fluid as their repertoire, adapting to survive. And survive they did, turning fashion into both shield and sword. When authorities in 15th century Nuremberg tried to force minstrels to wear identifying yellow stripes, a mark of shame, the performers retaliated by wearing the stripes as badges of pride, embellishing them with satirical motifs. Their defiance proved what they'd always known: clothing could be power. Whether stitching a lord's crest onto their sleeve to imply patronage or leaving it conspicuously bare to signal independence, minstrels wove their identities thread by thread, mastering the art of being seen exactly as they wished and no more. The leather leash in a minstrel's hand wasn't just a tether. It was a lifeline connecting them to the only constant companions they could rely on in a world of shifting loyalties. Picture a scruffy terrier trotting beside its master along the muddy ruts of a country road, ears pricked for both thieves and tossed scraps. These dogs were more than pets. They were early warning systems, their growls cutting through the minstrel's sleep when bandits or wolves prowled too close. Records from Burgundy even tell of a performing poodle named Jolicoeur, who supposedly saved his owner's life by biting a nobleman's wrist mid-swing, stopping a drunken dagger strike after a disputed song. But dogs were just the beginning. For minstrels who could afford the upkeep, monkeys became living punchlines dressed in tiny doublets to parody local officials, their antics loosening purse strings faster than any ballad. A well-trained capuchin might dance on command, steal a spectator's hat, or even pass a cup for coins, turning street performances into interactive theater. The downside, their notorious mischief. A Florentine minstrel's journal laments the day his monkey, Pulcinella, escaped into a monastery garden and devoured an entire crop of prized figs, earning them both 3 days' penance scrubbing floors. Then there were the true showstoppers, dancing bears. These massive creatures, often purchased as cubs from Eastern European traders, could draw crowds from miles around when they stood on their hind legs or lumbered in clumsy circles to a pipe's shrill tune. Their handlers, usually minstrels who traded music for animal training, faced constant danger. A bear's chain might snap during a performance, or worse, a hungry winter might drive the beast to desperation. The ballad Bruno's Last Dance tells of a bear who turned on his master during a snowbound journey, a tragic reminder that even the closest bonds frayed when survival hung in the balance. Birds added their own kind of magic. Parrots imported at great cost from distant lands could recite snippets of popular songs, their squawking voices becoming novelties in noble courts. More humble minstrels kept trained jackdaws or starlings that could mimic farmyard sounds or whistle simple tunes, delighting village children. But the cleverest avian companions were messenger pigeons. Some minstrels bred them to carry coded notes between towns, turning feathery couriers into a side business. The irony wasn't lost on these wanderers. In a profession built on human connection, their deepest trust often lay with creatures who asked no questions and demanded only food and shelter. A stray dog might share a minstrel's bread one night and vanish by morning, but in that brief companionship lay a truth too raw for song, that on the open road, sometimes the only audience who truly listened had 4 legs, wings, or paws. And when the last note faded and the crowd dispersed, it was to these silent partners that minstrels whispered their exhaustion, their fears, and occasionally their gratitude for one more day of shared survival under the vast medieval sky. The crackling firelight casts long shadows as the minstrel leans forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Now hear the tale of Arthur, the once and future king. With those words, yet another listener falls under the spell of a legend shaped not by dusty chronicles, but by generations of wandering storytellers whose embellishments turned local folklore into Europe's cultural backbone. Consider Excalibur, the magical sword early Welsh bards described as simply sharp became, in minstrel songs, a blade forged by fairy hands, its scabbard worth 10 kingdoms. This wasn't mere exaggeration, it was alchemy, transforming base historical fragments into narrative gold that gleamed brighter with each retelling. The Pied Piper's evolution reveals this process in action. What began as a grim 13th century account of missing children in Hamelin became, through minstrel ballads, a morality tale woven with supernatural flair. Earlier versions blamed the disappearances on plague or landslides, but performers, ever attuned to their audience's love of the eerie, added the rat catcher's hypnotic pipe and the town's betrayal, turning tragedy into a cautionary fable about broken promises. The rats themselves might have been a later insertion, some scholars suggest, inspired by the Black Death's trauma and minstrels' knack for updating old stories with contemporary fears. King Arthur's court benefited most from this creative license. The Round Table, that iconic symbol of equality, appears nowhere in early Welsh texts. It entered legend via French trouvers, minstrels who adapted Breton tales for aristocratic audiences hungry for chivalric ideals. Lancelot's adulterous affair with Guinevere, likely invented by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century to spice up courtly love sagas. Even Merlin's prophetic powers grew in the telling. Early sources depict him as a battle-crazed wildman, not the sagacious wizard of later romances. Each edition served a purpose, whether flattering patrons by linking them to Arthurian bloodlines or subtly critiquing feudal hypocrisy through allegory. But minstrels didn't just amplify existing myths, they stitched together regional fragments into grand tapestries. The Germanic hero Siegfried might never have met Burgundian Princess Kriemhild without performers bridging the gap between Scandinavian sagas and continental epics. Similarly, the tragic Irish legend of Derda absorbed Scottish elements as it traveled with minstrels across the Irish Sea, her story gaining new sorrows with every shoreline. This cultural fusion made minstrels the DJs of medieval folklore, remixing local traditions into pan-European hits. Their most subversive power lay in encoding contemporary struggles into timeless tales. When English minstrels sang of Robin Hood stealing from the rich, They weren't just entertaining, they were channeling peasant resentment of forest laws and tithes. The Slavic minstrels who transformed the vampire from a folkloric nuisance into a nobleman sucking the life from villages did so during periods of brutal feudal oppression. Even seemingly whimsical stories carried weight. The French Melusine legend about a serpent woman betrayed by her husband mirrored real anxieties over noblemen's treatment of common-born wives. What makes these adaptations remarkable is their fluidity. Unlike church-sanctioned narratives frozen in stained glass, minstrel stories mutated to fit each audience's needs. A Arthur ballad sung in London might emphasize his battles against Saxon invaders to stoke English patriotism, while the same performer in Brittany would highlight his mystical connections to the Celtic otherworld. The same tale could be a ribald tavern joke one night and a courtly allegory the next, proving folklore's resilience lay in its adaptability. Yet for all their creativity, minstrels rarely claimed authorship. Their genius was presenting ancient stories as if they'd always existed in their current form, hiding their craft behind phrases like, "as the old ones say." This illusion of timelessness ensured their versions stuck, while earlier iterations faded like footprints in rain. Today, when we picture Arthur pulling the sword from the stone or the Pied Piper leading children into a mountain, we're seeing not medieval reality, but the dazzling afterimage left by countless minstrels' voices echoing across the centuries, each adding a little more magic to the shadows around the fire. The lute strings still hummed in tavern courtyards, but a new sound was spreading across Europe. The crisp snap of printed pages turning, the rustle of pamphlets passing from hand to hand. The invention of the printing press in the mid-1500s didn't just change how words traveled. It rewrote the rules of storytelling itself. Minstrels who had once been the primary source of news and entertainment suddenly found themselves competing with something far more persistent than memory: ink on paper. A single printed ballad sheet could be reproduced by the thousands, carrying tunes and tales farther than any wandering performer's feet. Where a minstrel might tweak a song to suit each audience, these printed versions froze stories in permanent form, their words no longer bending to local dialects or political sensitivities. Yet it wasn't just technology that dimmed the minstrel's star. The Renaissance ushered in a craving for novelty. Elites now flocked to purpose-built theaters where professional actors performed scripted comedies and tragedies, their stages adorned with painted backdrops and mechanical special effects. In London, the Globe Theatre's roaring crowds made the lone minstrel with his lute seem quaint by comparison. Even music evolved. Polyphonic choral works performed in cathedral acoustics overshadowed the simple melodies of troubadours. A minstrel's improvised verses about local scandals couldn't compete with the polished sonnets of Shakespeare or the intricate madrigals of Monteverdi. Some minstrels adapted by becoming pamphleteers themselves, hawking printed versions of their songs in market squares. Others clung to rural routes where literacy spread more slowly, their ballads lingering in villages where books remained rare luxuries. The cleverest reinvented themselves as actors or musicians for hire in noble households, trading their wanderers' cloaks for liveried uniforms. But for many, the changing times meant fading into obscurity, their once vital role as living newspapers supplanted by gazettes and broadsheets that arrived weekly with ships and caravans. Still, their legacy refused to vanish entirely. The printed broadside ballads that flooded Europe owed their catchy refrains and simple structures to minstrel traditions. Playwrights like Molière borrowed stock characters from Commedia dell'arte, a descendant of minstrel troupes, while folk musicians kept old melodies alive in countryside dances. Even the protest songs of later centuries, from labor movements to civil rights marches, echoed the minstrel's knack for wrapping dissent in memorable melody. Perhaps their most enduring gift was the understanding that stories belong to everyone. The printed word might have claimed permanence, but minstrels had proven that tales grow richer when reshaped by each teller's voice. Long after their cloaks had frayed to dust, their spirit lived on in the lullabies mothers hummed, the drinking songs that united strangers, the anthems that rallied movements. They had been the original viral storytellers, and though the world moved on, the echoes of their songs still lingered in the spaces between the printed lines. The strum of an acoustic guitar in a smoky coffeehouse, the viral TikTok ballad skewering politicians, the YouTuber weaving history into lyrical narratives, these are the heirs to the minstrel's mantle. Though the cloaks and lutes have faded, the essence of their craft pulses through modern storytellers who blend melody, message, and mobility. Consider folk revivalists like Pete Seeger, whose "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" channeled the same anti-war urgency as medieval minstrels' plague ballads, or Bob Dylan's coded protest lyrics echoing the sly satire of songs that once mocked tax collectors. Even hip-hop artists, with their rhythmic storytelling and social commentary, follow the minstrel tradition of turning street truths into art that shakes power structures. The parallels run deeper than style like their medieval counterparts. Today's performers walk a tightrope between entertainment and provocation, their platforms replacing market squares but their dilemmas eerily familiar. YouTube troubadours exemplify this evolution. Creators like the history bard don doublets to sing Tudor gossip in auto-tuned melodies, while Lindsay Sterling's violin covers transform pop hits into instrumental narratives as vivid as any medieval ballad. What's striking is how these digital minstrels adapt ancient techniques. The cliffhanger ending that hooks viewers mirrors the minstrel's habit of pausing tales at dawn to ensure crowds returned at dusk. Patreon memberships, a modern twist on noble patronage, where subscribers replace feudal lords as benefactors. And just as minstrels tweaked songs for each audience, YouTubers analyze analytics to tailor content. Algorithmic court jesters reading the room in real time. Yet the most potent legacy lies in music's power to distill complex truths. When a busker in Barcelona strums a song about rent hikes, or a Nashville songwriter pens lyrics about factory closures, they're channeling the same alchemy that turned medieval famines into allegories. Even comedy musicians like Bo Burnham, with their sharp-witted critiques of internet culture, inherit the minstrel's role as society's funhouse mirror, laughter disarming audiences just enough to let the message slip through. The tools have changed: auto-tune instead of hurdy-gurdies, Spotify playlists over pilgrim routes, but the mission remains: to make us see our world anew, one verse at a time. Perhaps the purest continuation lives in street performers. Watch a subway musician in Paris fold current events into improvised lyrics, or a spoken word poet in Chicago spin neighborhood struggles into rhyme, and you're witnessing the unbroken thread. These artists, like minstrels of old, trade songs for survival, reading crowds with the same desperate acuity. When they upload performances to Instagram, they're simply extending the age-old circuit from castle to tavern, now from sidewalk to smartphone. The irony is rich. In our hyper-connected age, we've come full circle, craving the human touch of stories sung directly to us, unfiltered and alive. The minstrels may have hung up their cloaks, but their echoes linger wherever a voice rises to tell the truth and set it to music. The last note of the minstrel's lute fades into the evening air, but the echoes of their legacy linger like candles smoke in a medieval hall. These wanderers were more than purveyors of tunes and jests. They were the living pulse of an era, stitching together the fragmented heart of Europe with threads of melody and memory. In their songs, we hear the clatter of peasant carts and the whispered conspiracies of kings, the bawdy laughter of taverns and the solemn hymns of cloisters. They carried the weight of history not in scrolls or ledgers, but in the rhythm of a drum, the pluck of a string, the rise and fall of their voices against the silence of the past. Think of what they witnessed. The minstrel who sang at Agincourt might have later comforted a village ravaged by the same war. The one who performed for Elena of Aquitaine could have spun that encounter into a ballad about power and passion, sung centuries before Shakespeare put quill to parchment. Their art was a mirror held up to society, cracked perhaps and warped by time, but reflecting truths too raw for official chronicles. Where monks wrote of kings and battles, minstrels sang of the miller's daughter who outwitted a lord, or the widow who planted roses on her husband's grave. These weren't just stories, they were acts of quiet resistance, proof that even in the darkest ages, the human spirit could not be silenced. And so we're left with a question that hums beneath the surface of history. If a minstrel walked into our world today, what would they make of us? Would they strum ballads about the glow of screens replacing hearthlight, or craft satirical ditties about kings of commerce in glass towers? Perhaps they'd find kinship in the busker on a subway platform, or the viral songwriter whose lyrics unite strangers across continents. The medium has changed, but the mission remains to bear witness, to entertain, and above all, to remind us that every era, no matter how advanced, thrives on stories told face to face, heart to heart. So as the fire of this tale burns down to embers, let's keep the minstrel's spirit alive. Share your own stories in the comments. What song would you want them to sing about our world? And if you've enjoyed this journey through the melodies and misadventures of medieval Europe, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn the page to the next chapter of history waiting to be sung. The lute may be still, but the music never really